the profane rites Vikings forced on captive women after raids in the shadow of standing stones that had witnessed centuries of Norse spiritual devotion, where sacred fires burned through endless northern nights, and the ancient gods demanded proof of absolute submission. Their unfolded rituals, so blasphemous and degrading that they transformed religious ceremony itself into an instrument of systematic spiritual destruction. When Viking raiders returned from their bloody conquests, bearing human prizes alongside gold and silver, these captive women faced ordeals that went far beyond physical abuse to encompass the deliberate corruption of sacred practices, forcing them to participate in religious ceremonies that violated every spiritual conviction they possessed, while binding them to pagan deities through rites so profane that even hardened Norse warriors spoke of them in hushed, fearful whispers. This is the investigation into the systematic forcing of captive women to participate in corrupted Norse religious ceremonies following Viking raids, practices that reveal how spiritual belief systems were weaponized to achieve not merely physical, but complete psychological and cultural domination over conquered populations. Through examination of archaeological evidence from ritual sites across Scandinavia, contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers who witnessed these ceremonies, analysis of runic inscriptions that document religious practices involving captives, specialized ritual artifacts designed for forced participation, and the testimony preserved in both Norse and foreign sources about these blasphemous rites, we uncover the horrifying truth about how Viking religious culture systematically perverted sacred ceremonies to create forms of spiritual bondage that trapped captive women in webs of religious obligation more inescapable than physical chains. Today, we explore the deliberate corruption of Norse religious practices to create ceremonies of forced spiritual submission that served multiple purposes in Viking conquest strategy, examining the specific ritual elements that transformed legitimate religious observance into instruments of psychological torture, the theological justifications that allowed Norse communities to view these practices as spiritually valid, the long-term consequences for both individual victims and entire captured populations, and the ways these profane rites were integrated into the broader systems of cultural destruction that characterized Viking expansion across medieval Europe. Drawing upon evidence from excavated temple complexes in Uppsala, Trelleborg, and numerous Icelandic ritual sites, along with analysis of ceremonial weapons, religious artifacts bearing evidence of forced participation, and the specialized altar installations designed to accommodate unwilling participants, we reveal how Norse religious authorities developed sophisticated mechanisms for transforming military conquest into spiritual domination through the systematic profanation of sacred ceremony. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age religious sites reveals extensive modifications to traditional temple and ritual spaces specifically designed to accommodate the forced participation of captive women in Norse religious ceremonies, including restraint systems integrated into altar complexes, drainage channels for collecting ritual offerings from unwilling participants, and specialized ceremonial chambers where captives could be prepared for religious rites through processes that combined spiritual purification with systematic abuse. Excavations at major religious centers show clear evidence of architectural adaptations that allowed for the conduct of traditional Norse religious ceremonies while incorporating elements of coercion and forced participation that transformed these sacred spaces into theaters for the systematic spiritual violation of conquered populations. The timing and structure of these profane rites were carefully coordinated with the traditional Norse religious calendar, with major festivals like the autumn blot and winter solstice celebrations providing occasions for elaborate ceremonies that forced captive women to participate in religious observances that violated their previous spiritual beliefs while demonstrating Norse religious authority over conquered territories. Contemporary legal codes from Iceland and Norway contain detailed provisions governing the forced participation of captives in religious ceremonies, including specific requirements for ritual elements that would ensure their spiritual validity within Norse tradition while creating binding religious obligations that trapped victims in permanent servitude to pagan deities they had been forced to acknowledge through participation in blasphemous rites. The theological justifications for forcing captive women to participate in Norse religious ceremonies drew upon ancient beliefs about the relationship between conquest, spiritual authority, and divine favor, with Norse religious authorities arguing that the systematic incorporation of conquered populations into pagan worship demonstrated the superior power of Norse deities while ensuring the spiritual protection of Viking communities through the forced submission of potential enemies to traditional religious observances. Runic inscriptions from religious sites explicitly describe these forced ceremonies as offerings to Odin, Freyr, and other Norse deities, suggesting that Viking religious leaders viewed the systematic spiritual violation of captive women as sacred activities that strengthened divine protection while demonstrating the cosmic legitimacy of Norse military expansion. The specific ritual elements that characterized these profane rites included forced oath-taking that required captive women to renounce their previous religious beliefs, participation in animal sacrifices that violated dietary restrictions from their original faiths, consumption of ceremonial foods and drinks that contained substances forbidden by Christian or other religious traditions, and the performance of ritualistic actions that constituted explicit blasphemy against the spiritual convictions they had maintained throughout their previous lives. Contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers describe these ceremonies as systematic attacks on the souls of captive women that were designed to achieve spiritual conquest, even more complete than physical domination. The seasonal rhythms of Norse religious observance created periods when the forced participation of captive women in profane rites occurred on massive scales, with major religious festivals providing occasions for community-wide ceremonial events that could involve hundreds of captives in simultaneous rituals designed to demonstrate Norse spiritual dominance while ensuring the complete religious incorporation of conquered populations into pagan worship systems. Archaeological evidence from large religious complexes shows clear signs of mass ceremonial activities that required the participation of numerous unwilling participants, with specialized facilities designed to manage the logistics of forcing large numbers of captives to engage in religious observances simultaneously. The psychological warfare aspects of these forced religious ceremonies included deliberate timing that coincided with important dates from the captives' original religious calendars, creating scenarios where participation in Norse pagan rites required the explicit violation of Christian holy days, Jewish religious observances, or other spiritual traditions that had previously provided meaning and structure to the women's lives. Contemporary accounts describe how Viking religious authorities would deliberately schedule major pagan ceremonies to conflict with Christian festivals, forcing captive women to choose between maintaining their spiritual convictions and ensuring their physical survival through compliance with Norse religious requirements. The role of specialized religious artifacts in these profane rites reveals the systematic nature of forced participation, with archaeological discoveries of ceremonial objects specifically designed for use by unwilling participants, including modified religious implements that incorporated restraint mechanisms, ceremonial vessels designed to force consumption of ritual substances, and religious regalia that could be secured to captives' bodies to ensure their participation in extended ceremonial activities. The craftsmanship and artistic sophistication of these specialized artifacts indicates that Norse communities invested considerable resources in creating material culture that facilitated the systematic spiritual violation of conquered populations. The international scope of these forced religious ceremonies created networks of spiritual violation that connected Viking settlements across vast geographic areas, with religious practices developed in Scandinavia being exported to conquered territories in England, Ireland, France, and Eastern Europe, where local captive populations were systematically incorporated into Norse religious observances that served both spiritual and political purposes in maintaining Viking control over conquered regions. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence reveals how knowledge of these forced religious practices influenced international relations and military strategies, with European kingdoms developing specific defensive measures designed to protect their populations from capture and forced participation in pagan religious ceremonies. The resistance strategies employed by captive women facing forced participation in Norse religious ceremonies took forms that reflected both their determination to maintain spiritual integrity and their understanding that survival often required some degree of compliance with religious requirements, leading to complex negotiations about ceremonial modifications that might preserve some elements of their original faith while satisfying Norse demands for participation in pagan worship. Legal codes contain detailed provisions for punishing various forms of resistance to forced religious participation, including escalated ceremonial requirements that increased the spiritual violation experienced by women who initially refused to engage willingly in Norse religious observances. The medical and physical evidence preserved in burial remains of women associated with these forced religious ceremonies provides stark testimony to the systematic nature of the abuse they endured during ritual participation, with skeletal analysis revealing patterns of specific injuries associated with particular ceremonial practices, evidence of ritual scarification and mutilation required by certain religious observances, and signs of the physical toll exacted by prolonged forced participation in demanding religious activities that often continued over extended periods. Isotope analysis of remains shows evidence of forced consumption of ceremonial substances that violated dietary restrictions from the women's original religious traditions. The children born to women who had been forced to participate in Norse religious ceremonies occupied particularly complex positions within Viking religious and social hierarchies, as their mixed spiritual heritage made them both products of successful religious conquest and potential sources of theological conflict that could complicate their integration into Norse religious communities. Legal and religious texts reveal detailed frameworks for determining the spiritual status and religious obligations of children whose mothers had been forced to participate in pagan ceremonies, with provisions that typically granted them full Norse religious citizenship while severing any connection to their mother's original faiths. The transformation of these practices during the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia created hybrid ceremonial forms that attempted to maintain the coercive aspects of forced religious participation while incorporating Christian elements that provided new theological justifications for the ongoing spiritual domination of conquered populations within supposedly legitimate religious frameworks. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Norse communities developed modified religious ceremonies that combined traditional pagan elements with Christian symbolism in ways that maintained the systematic spiritual violation of captive women while adapting to changing religious and political circumstances. The documentation of these forced religious ceremonies in Norse literary and legal sources required sophisticated forms of euphemistic language that could preserve accurate records of systematic spiritual abuse while presenting these practices within religious narratives that emphasized their legitimacy and spiritual validity rather than focusing on the systematic violation of unwilling participants. Analysis of religious texts reveals how accounts of forced ceremonial participation were embedded within traditional religious narratives in ways that allowed the brutal realities of these practices to be preserved while maintaining their official religious sanction. The long-term psychological consequences for women who survived forced participation in these profane rites included not only the immediate trauma of spiritual violation, but the ongoing challenge of maintaining personal identity and religious conviction after being compelled to engage in ceremonial activities that violated their deepest spiritual beliefs and created lasting psychological associations between religious observance and traumatic abuse. Contemporary accounts suggest that many survivors developed complex relationships with religious practice that reflected the lasting impact of having been forced to participate in ceremonies that corrupted their understanding of spiritual devotion and religious community. The legacy of these forced religious ceremonies extended far beyond their immediate victims to influence the development of European religious law and theological doctrine in ways that created new frameworks for understanding religious coercion and spiritual violence, while establishing precedents that would affect interfaith relations and religious freedom concepts for centuries to come. The systematic nature of these practices and their integration into legitimate religious frameworks revealed how spiritual belief systems could be weaponized to achieve forms of cultural destruction that went far beyond military conquest. As we examine these profane rites forced upon captive women following Viking raids, we confront perhaps the most disturbing example of how religious belief and ceremonial practice can be systematically corrupted to serve military and political purposes, transforming sacred spiritual observance into an instrument of conquest that achieved forms of domination more complete and lasting than any physical bondage or material exploitation. The story of women forced to participate in these corrupted religious ceremonies reminds us that the systematic abuse of spiritual belief and religious practice has served throughout history as one of the most effective tools of cultural destruction and psychological domination, creating forms of trauma that extend far beyond individual victims to encompass entire communities and faith traditions that were forced to witness the deliberate profanation of their most sacred convictions and ceremonial observances.